عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا محمد حبيب رب العالمين، وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا وهدينا وخيرنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on the path of piety, in which we're looking at the Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya of the great Imam al-Birgivi, rahimahullahu ta'ala, one of the great scholars of the Ottoman tradition, we have been looking at the pathways of taqwa and looking at the blameworthy traits of the heart that taqwa entails one get rid of. And we are looking at one of the most critical of the blameworthy traits of the heart, which is riya, showing off, or insincerity. And this is one of those traits that we need to be deeply cognizant of getting rid of as believers, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهِ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. They've been commanded only that they serve Allah, making their religion sincere unto Him. Right? مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. And ikhlas, sincerity, is for your actions to be free, to be for Allah, and to be free of any of the qualities of insincerity. Now, insincerity can be seen in different ways, right? It has different motives, which we looked at in the previous section on riya, on insincerity or showing off. Riya also can be seen as a riya'ul jali and a riya'ul khafi. There is manifest showing off, obvious showing off, where one clearly, if you pause and ask, why are you doing this? You would answer with an answer that is other than for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So you have a teacher coming to town, so you say, you know what? I want to impress the Shaykh, so I'm going to put on this nice shukr jacket and this nice shawl. I'm going to put on the best cap I have so I can impress the Shaykh. Is that for Allah? No, that's riya, that's insincerity, that's showing off. Acting for other than the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes it can be obvious. Now, when it's obvious, it could be hidden from us. It's obvious, but it's hidden from us. Why? Because we don't think about it. We don't consider our motives. So the obvious riya could be hidden from us due to our ghafla, our heedlessness, and our lack of muhasaba, of taking ourselves to account. But then you have actual subtle riya, where the test of which would be, if you ask yourself, why are you doing this? You would pause. And you're initially uncertain. But if you were to check, the primary driver is not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His good pleasure. And in particularly in religious matters, this is destructive. So we saw that the fourth investigation is related to riya, to insincerity, is what's called a riya'ul khafi, hidden riya, right? And we saw that when one is driven to do something for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one could connect it to a good motive, right? And then it would not be insincerity. But we said that that's still a slippery slope, right? So for example, if you're in public and you're going to pray in accordance with You're going to take care to pray much better. There you should remember that, well, I intend ta'aleem, that for people to learn how to pray better. But even then, the safety is tahrirun niyya lillah, to make one's intention purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So that's why that sense of satisfaction with a good deal, if people see it or praise it or become aware of it, that satisfaction could be insincerity, unless the satisfaction arises from guiding others to the good, inspiring others to the good, etc., as we saw. But as he himself closes what we looked at last time, that لكن كثيرا ما يدخله تلبيس فليكن على بصيرة. Very often these kinds of situations cause تلبيس, cause confusion, right? So let one have insight, right, regarding one's affairs. From the subtle signs of riya, this is where we reached. It says وَمِنْهَا أَنْ يُحِبَّ أَنْ يُوَقِّرَهُ النَّاسِ. From the subtle signs of insincerity is to like being respected by people. وَيُثْنُوا عَلَيْهِ, and to be praised by people. وَأَنْ يُنَشِّطُوا فِي قَضَاءِ حَوَائِجِهِ, and that you like people to hasten to fulfill your needs. وَأَنْ يُسَامِحُوهُ فِي الْبَيْعِ وَالشِّرَاءِ, and you want people to excuse you in your transactions. So when you buy something, you kind of want, unstated, that they give you a discount, that they give you better terms. Why? Because I am something. This can be indicative of insincerity, of why you are seeking, why you have that recognition and cultivating it. But it's also indicative of other things: pride, arrogance, conceit. You know, these comes as an integrated package. للأسف. وأن يوسع له في المكان, and to make extra space for him. So if you come to a gathering, of course the adab is, if you come to a gathering, the adab for the one who comes into a gathering, where do you sit? حيث ينتهي المجلس, wherever there is a gap at the back of the majlis, right? And that you do not disturb the attendees, and you don't disturb, for example, if it's a majlis of knowledge or dhikr, those at the front of the majlis. But if you expect to get a prominent place, and you dislike a non-prominent place, then this again is a sign of insincerity, right? فإن قصر فيه مقصر ثقل على قلبه, right? Right? And if someone has shortcomings in this, then one finds it heavy in one's heart. So you go to, in any of these scenarios, right? That someone introduced you and they just said, this is Brother Faraz. They didn't give you a title, they didn't mention anything about you. You find that heavy. That's a problem. Or you went shopping and they didn't praise you, or they didn't give you a discount. And the stories of the early Muslims in being very careful about this are great. And this is from Siratul Ulama, that they're very, very careful. And this relates not only to hidden riya, and part of this is to preserve one's own sincerity for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, examples that I've seen of this myself, Shaykh Adib Kallas, rahimahullah, once we finished certain texts in Aqidah, I asked him what we should study next, and he asked me, so what do you think we should study next? I said, Sayyidi, it's your call. So he chose that we cover Hashiyat al-Bajuri on the Sanusiyya, Imam Bajuri's super commentary on the Sanusiyya. And so we agreed to that. And he said, I don't have a copy. So I said, I'll get you a copy. I said, Inshallah, Bismillah, we'll begin next week, whatever. And then he insisted on paying for the copy. Even though, of course, it was inconceivable that he or anyone else of the Mashayikh of Damascus would charge for a class, but even for the copy of the book, he said, I won't take it until you tell me how much it was. And it was not very much. It's not a big book in size. So it was about $1.60 US. I think 80 liras, plus or minus. And he kept losing his copy, because those days his granddaughter, she's a little girl, he'd be quote unquote taking care of her in his library, and she would go move books around. Anyways, so I ended up selling 4 copies, I think 4 copies, yes, 3, 4, 5, a bunch of copies to him, because he kept misplacing his copy. So I used to just keep an extra copy with me, but every copy he paid for, right? Why? Because we don't take advantage, we don't take anything from our students in that way, right? And he'd be exceedingly careful, and that's the Sirat al-Mashayikh in matters, right? They'd be exceptionally careful about anything monetary. Rather, you'd see them giving to their students, right? So one of the Mashayikh from Pakistan, he came to Jordan in 2003, and then one of his relatives came just under 2 years later, and we hosted him, and he had an envelope from the Shaykh who'd visited just under 2 years later. And that envelope, and this is around 2005, had $3,000 in it. And just to give context, at that time, my monthly budget in Jordan, I was living in Jordan, was about $500 to $600 at most a month, okay? Depending on how many books I purchased. This is an unrealistic amount. So I asked the Shaykh who was visiting, Sayyidi, what's this for? He said, it's a gift. I said, why? He said, why are gifts given? I couldn't believe it. It's like 6 months. He said, who is it for? I said, I believe your name is on it. I wasn't going to accept. I said, I was totally at a loss. He said, no, you're a talib, I'm sure you can find good things to do, etc. Or there may be other people, you keep some. There's some other students who could benefit. So the Shaykh, and we just, for us, it was such an honor that we were able to host one of the senior mashayikh of this ummah, a great faqih, 2 years before, and we sort of squeezed him dry, right? Like asked him hundreds and hundreds of questions. But as a gesture of gratitude, he sent these funds. I was totally, alhamdulillah, one of my friends was getting married, a Jordanian. He's getting married, he said Allah will provide. So gave half of it to him. And didn't tell Umar how much came in. Bought a lot of books with a big chunk of that, and the other kept it in the home budget. Paid a couple of debts. But that's how you find, and he's not some wealthy man, but he's, this is the sakha'ul ulama, right? And was done with utmost, it actually didn't even put a note that I'm sending you this for this, whatever. He sent a letter just thanking me for whatever. Made no, and there's a thing, it just said, for so-and-so. Right? So it didn't even make a any kind of statement on what was done. Radiyallahu ta'ala anhum. Right, so he says that if someone does not give them this recognition, this will be heavy on their heart. وَوَجَدَ لِذَلِكَ اسْتِبْعَادًا وَكَانَ نَفْسُهُ تَنْقَاضِي الْإِحْتِرَامِ. Right? And their soul, their self demands, right, or becomes constricted because one didn't get that respect. عَلَى الَّتِي أَخْفَاهَا, and feels this negative, feels slighted towards a person who did not express that respect, that recognition, or that favor. ولو لم يكن سبقت منه تلك الطاعة. Even if one hadn't done that act of obedience previously, right? Because showing off is in an act of obedience, right? So let's say you taught somebody, okay? This is an act of obedience. Then afterwards you expected some special treatment. This expectation entails that could entail that you didn't teach them purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? لما كان يستبعد ذلك ومهما لم يكن وجود العبادة كعدمها فيما يتعلق بالخلق لم يكن وجوده خاليا عن شوب خفي. Says, and any time you're doing an act of devotion and you're not doing it in the things that relate to people exactly the same with respect to how they treat you, that entails that the act of devotion that you did was not free of some hidden blemish. How? You, for example, there's a student studying overseas. You facilitated, you gave them some of your charity. Now the charity is what? Yeah, it's an act of devotion for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, if you expect that they treat you differently upon having given them charity vis-a-vis you not having given them charity, then your motive could well be admixed. Right? يعني عن شوب خفي من الرياء ومهما أدركت نفسه تفرقة من أن يطلع على عبادته إنسان أو بهيمة ففيه شعبة من الرياء. And at any time you find any distinction between a human being seeing you do an act of devotion or a wild animal seeing you do an act of devotion, there is inevitably some hidden insincerity. So you decide to pray the weather is really nice, so after Fajr you want to do Salatul Duha in your garden. You found a quiet corner, there's a nice gentle breeze blowing, so you're praying there. You think it's for the sake of Allah, but now someone comes in. For there to be a difference in your heart as to a human being seeing you, or it was just what animal might walk by? Well, a skunk, you'd probably be a bit scared, but what could be an animal that comes by? Anyone? In the Greater Toronto area? A rabbit came by, or a coyote came, and the coyote is staring at you. Most of us aren't trying to impress the coyotes with our ibadah, right? Right? So if you find a distinction between a human being or a wild animal, a behemoth, seeing you, then there is some insincerity in it. So you have to be careful of your motives. Because sometimes we'll do something apparently in private, but almost inviting attention. So we need to right? And it's come in a hadith that none of you believes until their prayer between people is like their prayer before their flock of sheep. Right? Right? Wallahu alam about the strength of that. Right? Why? إلا أن يقارنه الملاحظة أو الاستدلال يعني السابقان وقليل ما هم, unless your recognition that someone, your pleasure at the recognition that someone can see you be connected with those aforementioned considerations, that you have the intention that you want to inspire someone else to do the good, or you want to guide them to do the good, right? Or you see that as being Allah manifesting the good for you, or you take from it an indicator of Allah, you know, just as He has manifested good for you in this life, that He manifests good for you in the next life. But it's about Allah, not about yourself. But He says, وَقَلِيلٌ مَا هُمْ, and this is rare. This is rare. Right, this is rare. This is why there's no safety, right? Without working hard on one's sincerity. Right? Right? So what does one do? He tells us, فَلْيَكُنْ عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ وَحَذَرٍ مِنَ التَّلْبِيسِ. Right? So let the devotee who's striving for sincerity have deep awareness, basira, deep awareness, deep consciousness, right? وَحَذَرٍ, and caution about self-deception. Right? About self-deception. فَإِنَّ النَّاقِدَ بصير لا يخفى عليه قليل ولا صغير, because the one who has, because the critic, right? The critic, and who should you be critical of? We all have critical faculties. People like being critics. They like critiquing books. They like critiquing scholars and leaders and politicians. What about critiquing yourself? And don't exhaust your critical faculty with others. That is something to critique yourself. Not to put yourself down, but to be able to rise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَإِنَّ النَّاقِدَ بَصِيرٌ, because the critic is well aware. So be the well-aware critic. Right? لا يخفى عليه قليل ولا صغير. And the critic would not be unaware of small things, right? Small things or even subtle things, right? So you direct your critical faculty towards your intention. How do you direct it towards the intention? In three ways, right? Right? So you make naqd an-niyya, right? Naqd an-niyya, right? قبل العمل, right? Before the action, أثناء العمل, right? During the action, And thirdly, بعد العمل. Right? You have to critically evaluate your intention before the action. How? Don't just jump into things. Right? That's why the ulama teach, and that's why the ulama found formulas for stating one's intention before actions to teach us to have sincerity and multiple intentions before one begins a class. Right? Right? Things like the dua of Imam al-Haddad, the niyat, talab al-ilm, and the other intentions for different things. Right? They recommended a talaffuz bin-niyya, to state one's intention. Right? In anything, before you go to work even, before you sit down to study, just verbalize your intention. Nawaitu bi talab al-ilm wajh Allah ta'ala. Right? Nawaitu bi hadha ad-dars. I intend with this class rida Allah ta'ala. Right? How? And you state it. You can make your own intention. We would recommend Imam al-Haddad's intentions for seeking knowledge, for example, or the like of that, right? To make that to be very clear. And you apply that in your devotion, acts of devotion, you apply that in your life, right? Before you read Quran, right? Right? Before you read Quran. Before you go to work. Before you visit family, anything. Right, so that's, critique your intention before you begin. During the action, how? By istihdar al-niyya, by keeping that intention in mind. This is for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By remaining in dhikr during the action. And guarding against insincerity. Because you go with a good motive and they say, oh, mashallah, I heard you finished such and such thing. So you went with a good intention, now suddenly you start showing off. So you remain on guard, right, during an action. Because actions are made up of parts, and intention can come in, right? So someone had a very sincere motive why they asked a question. Now, if you fear insincerity, does it mean you don't ask a question? No. So, but before you check your intention, why you're asking the question. But then, when you're asked the question, the teacher asks you, so how do you think of that question? And that's when you lose your grip. So, I was up all night thinking about this issue and I checked 16 books and I did the... Why are you mentioning all that? Because actions are made up of parts. And each of the constituent parts, you have to guard your intention behind it. As you're attending the class. You attended the class sincerely, but during the class, you need to struggle to maintain your intention, stay in remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and guard against insincerity. Part of it is to know that any bigger action is made up of parts. And you have to guard yourself in each of those parts from insincerity. Just like in the prayer. You're praying, you started for the sake of Allah. During the prayer, you notice there's someone sitting reading Quran next to you. So now you're going to go in sujood. So you decided to do the perfect sajda. Did you perfect that for the sake of Allah? I'm not sure. I hope so. No. Be self-critical. Would you have done it that way were that person not present? Do you normally do that when you're alone? Not really. That's why during the action you have to be self-critical, be on guard. Which is why that it's a sunnah, right? You make intention in the beginning, but you istihdaru niyya, right? And keeping the intention present, wastishabun niyya. They're also called istishabun niyya. to keep the intention, and تبقى نيته مصاحبة لعمله, to make the intention accompany your actions, the constituent parts, your sajda, etc. Right? To keep that purposefulness in each of the constituent actions. Because each of them, is the sajda a separate action? No. But is it a standalone act? Is it? Yes. So the prayer is an example. Is the prayer one act or made up of multiple acts? Which one is it? Any of our onliners? One act or multiple? Yeah, it's one action, but it's also made up of multiple parts. But each of those parts, you need to be on guard. That's why we should take what the ulama say, deeply, right? فَلْيَكُنْ عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ وَحَذْرٍ مِنَ التَّلْبِيسِ. Let be insightful and wary of being confused. فَإِنَّ النَّاقِضَ بَصِيرٌ, because the critic is aware. لَا يَخْفَى عَلَيْهِ قَلِيلٌ وَلَا صَغِيرٌ. They're not unaware of a little or small thing. And part of that is these constituent parts. Right? So you started praying on your own, right? So you came to Seekers and you're praying on your own now for Maghrib, and now there's 5 people have joined in. So you started sincerely for Allah, but now there's people behind you, you're going to be reciting. You say, I've just tuned up my recitation of Surah Al-A'la. Let me recite that. Why? Because there's people behind me. You wouldn't have recited Surah Al-A'la before. Right? So insincerity crept in. Now, rarely on its own is that motive directly connected to being for the sake of Allah or to be for inspiration, guiding, and these motives. Safety is one keeps renewing one's intention, right? You just have to keep renewing one's intention, right? Ultimately, it strives to have presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you're present with Allah, right? احفظ الله يحفظك. احفظ الله تجده تجاهك. Right? As the Prophet ﷺ told Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas when he was just a child. احفظ الله, guard Allah. That has so many meanings. احفظ الله في نياتك وأعمالك وخطراتك وسكناتك. Guard Allah in your intentions and in your actions, in your movements and in your rests. احفظ الله يحفظك, and He will guard you. Be mindful of Allah in your intentions and your actions, in your movements and in your rest. Be mindful of you. احفظ الله, remain mindful of Allah. Right? This is للتأكيد. Right? So begin mindful of Allah, but then remain mindful of Allah. تجده أمامك, you will find Him in front of you. That's presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? تجده تجاهك in the more famous narration. The other narration, which Imam Nawawi mentions both, if you can see Hadith 19 in the Arba'in, تجده أمامك, you'll find Him in front of you. But then in the second narration, the Prophet said, تعرف إلى الله في الرخاء يعرفك في الشدة. Get to know Allah when it's easy. Right? Al-Rakha is when things are expansive. يعرفك في الشدة. And He'll know you when things are intense. The Rakha and the Shidda have to do not only with when times are easy, but also in the easy choices. Do we struggle with insincerity when we're drinking water? Is it difficult to be sincere in drinking water? Is it? In general. Like most of the time when we drink water, just go to the fridge, drink water. Are we showing off? Are we? You use your right hand for things, for noble things. Is it difficult to do? No. So one of the ways to train oneself in sincerity, and that's why the adab of the Sharia are so important, right? Because they're easy things. If train yourself in the things that are easy. Ta'arraf ila Allah, get to know Allah in the easy things in life. Where your sincerity is not that readily tested most of the time. Right? Going into the washroom, how you do your routine acts, make them for Allah. Because yes, that requires consciousness and awareness, but if you get to know Allah in these easy things, the adab of the Sharia, none of them are difficult. Putting on your shoe with the right foot, is it difficult to do? And to do it for the sake of Allah? How often do we get to show off when we're putting on our shoes? Rarely. Right? But in the easy choices, get to know Allah how? Do it explicitly for Allah. Practice. And that's easy practice. Right? I'm driving for the sake of Allah. It's not a difficult choice to make. Because normally we're not showing off when we're driving our car. Right? Get to know Allah when things are easy, in the easy choices in life. But when there are difficult choices, you're going up on the mimbar. You're going to give that talk. You're going to make that announcement. You're going to ask the question in the class. You're asked to speak about Black Lives Matter or whatever. Can you be sincere? Those are more difficult things. Right? So that's during an action, you have to, these are three things. To maintain the intention, to stay in remembrance, and to be on guard about each of the constituent elements in the prayer. And switching off can be dangerous, especially in public. But also in private, teach yourself, do it, strive to do it the same way in private and in public to the extent that you can. And then after the action, that's why we seek forgiveness, because if you consider that sincerity is required not only in the beginning of the action, but during the action in its constituent parts, to be safe. You realize that you fall short. That's why we make istighfar after the prayer, right? 3 times, right? And likewise other actions. Afterwards we take حاسبوا أنفسكم قبل أن تحاسبوا. Take yourselves to account, right? Before you take into account. You ask Allah for qabul, and you seek for acceptance, that's the hope, and you seek forgiveness for your shortcomings, and you resolve to do better. Right? Another of the signs of riya, he says, وَمِنْهَا أَنَّهُ لَوْ كَانَ لَهُ صَاحِبَانِ غَنِيٌّ وَفَقِيرٌ وَوَجَدَ عِنْدَ إقبال الغني زيادة هزة في نفسه لإكرامه إلا إذا كان في الغني زيادة علم أو ورع أو صداقة سابقة أو نحوها. Right? That if you have 2 friends, a wealthy friend and a poor friend, and you find at the coming of the wealthy friend a greater rejoicing or happiness or satisfaction than at the coming of the poor friend, in order to, to be with them, then this is a sign of subtle riya. Unless the wealthy friend is more knowledgeable. So you're happy because so then you're happy at something pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or they're more scrupulous. Or you have a lasting old relationship. أو نحوها, or something like that. Right? And this is very dangerous because for anyone and this is particularly in religious matters, right? He's talking particularly to students of knowledge, to those involved in da'wah, those involved in religious service, right? Involved in the community, that if a wealthy attendee comes and a poor student who has lots of questions, are you more happy that the wealthy person comes? Why? Whether it's for personal benefit or for the organization's benefit. Either way. One has to be exceptionally careful. Right? Because with insincerity, it becomes haba'an manthura, like dust in the wind. فمن كان استرواحه إلى مشاهدة الأغنياء أكثر بدون ما ذكر فهو مراء. So whoever's satisfaction at seeing the wealthy is greater than seeing the poor without what we have mentioned, without this person being more knowledgeable, more scrupulous, or being an old friend, or something like that, then they're insincere, right? Rather, the sincere person would be pleased with serving the poor person lillahi ta'ala and serving the wealthy person lillahi ta'ala. And that's the example of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His da'wah was to the poor and the wealthy, the influential and the forgotten, right? And he used to give كان يعطي صلى الله عليه وسلم كل جليس نصيبه, right? He would give everyone who was with him their due of his attention. He did not ignore the wealthy, but he did not ignore the poor, right? And what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala command the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam about being with the poor? وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ مع الذين يدعون ربهم بالغداة والعشي يريدون وجهه. Right? Make yourself remain patient with those who call upon their Lord by morning and by night, seeking His countenance alone. Right? Whom was this specifically revealed about? Whom was it specifically revealed about? The early Muslims, particularly Ahl Suffa, right? Were at the back of the masjid. Many of them were living in the masjid. They were in abject poverty. They had dedicated themselves to knowledge, to learning the deen, to the preservation of the Quran, to da'wah, to serve the community, to devotion, right? And the Prophet ﷺ had an angelic temperament. Temperaments take from the perfect temperament of the Prophet ﷺ. It was not easy. They smelled. Some of them were going through a lot of difficulties in their own lives. Some of them who had entered Islam and were living there, it was difficult. وَلَا تَعْدُ عَيْنَاكَ عَنْهُمْ. Let your gaze not shift from them. أي إلى غيرهم تريد زينة الحياة الدنيا. زينة الحياة الدنيا. Right? Seeking the glitter of this worldly life. Right? How does the verse continue? And do not وَلَا تُطِعْ مَنْ أَغْفَلْنَا قَلْبَهُ عَنْ ذِكْرِنَا. And do not obey the one whose heart we have made heedless of our remembrance. وَاتَّبَعَ هَوَاهُ. And who follows their mere whim. وَكَانَ أَمْرُهُ فُرُطًا. Correct? And whose affair is unprincipled, it's all over the place, right? That yes, well, there may, right? But the prophetic principle is أعطي كل ذي حق حقه. Give all who have a right their due right. Yes, practically, the one engaged in teaching or da'wah or running a project needs to pay attention to potential donors, to etc. But if they just do that'll become insincere in their own motives and in their organizational motives. What about others? Right? One of the safeties in that is always remain under the shadow of the people of Allah. Right? And these verses, what surah are they from? Yeah, from Surah Al-Kahf. So the numerous surahs, numerous lessons, right, in Surah Al-Kahf that one should be reflecting upon, right? That who should you be? Should be with those who are sincere, whether wealthy or poor, right? But also, what are you pleased with? You're pleased with that which is pleasing to Allah. Qualities of that are found with the poor, qualities of that are found with the wealthy. But you do not deal with the poor because of their poverty, nor the rich because of their richness. You deal with people for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But one of the things that causes one to veer away from that sincerity of consideration is what? Is to be guided by those heedless of Allah. وَلَا تُطِعْ مَنْ أَغْفَلْنَا قَلْبَهُ عَنْ ذِكْرِنَا. Do not obey this either by listening to them or by being guided by their ideas and thinking. Right? وَلَا تُطِعْ مَنْ أَغْفَلْنَا قَلْبَهُ عَنْ ذِكْرِنَا. Who should we be listening to and inspired by? The opposite. Right? Rather, obey those who are conscious of Allah and conscious of seeking His pleasure. Whom are we consulting? Don't just consult some random management consultants or, okay, right now non-profits need to do this. Right now, Muslim scholars, there's kids who are writing blogs about what the ulama should be doing. And people are listening to them. Why? Whatever. We don't even know who it is. Right? وَلَا تُطِعْ مَنْ أَغْفَلْنَا قَلْبَهُ عَنْ ذِكْرِنَا وَاتَّبَعَ هَوَاهُ. And who is following their whim. Rather, follow people of principle. What is principle? العاقل من ترجع تصرفاته إلى أصل ثابت. The intelligent person is the one whose conduct returns to established principles. Religious, rational, and customary, as Imam Zarruq mentions. وَكَانَ أَمْرُهُ فُرُطًا. And their own affair is a mess, right? Is in excess or remissness, right? So whom are we inspired by, guided by? Right? And if somebody is not inspired by or guided by consulting the people of remembrance of Allah and religious, rational, and social principle, whose own affairs are in good order, then one's priorities will be imbalanced and all over the place, and will not be safe in these sensitive choices. وَمِنْهَا, right? So, ومن العلامات المختصة بالعلم بالعالم والواعظ والشيخ أنه لو ظهر من هو أحسن منه وعظا، right? أو أغزر علما والناس أشد له قبولا ساءه وحسده، right? And from the signs of subtle riya that are specific, subtle insincerity that are specific to the scholar or the preacher, the public speaker, or the shaykh, the spiritual guide here, right? That if there appears someone who is better than them as a preacher in their public speaking, or deeper in knowledge, or people just have more turning towards them, they dislike that and they're envious of that person. Whereas if people find benefit elsewhere, what should the believer's attitude be? That's pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One's inclination should be to assist them in the good. Right? And this is why, and Imam al-Ghazali and people before him and after him taught extensively about sincerity and its relationship with envy. Right? Right? Al-Ikhlas wal-Riya wal-Hasad. Right? That if you're envious of someone else, it is indicative of insincerity. Why? Because if you're seeking the pleasure of Allah and there's someone who is teaching people what benefits them, who is inspiring them towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whom people are taking deen from, and it irks you because you wish you had that instead, right? Not only is that envy, but that's indicative of lack of ikhlas yourself and the existence of riya, of subtle insincerity. And that's not, and this, right? That's why one of the most important treatises on sincerity, the Risala of Wali Raslan al-Dimashqi, which is translated into English as well, the treatise concerning divine oneness, translated by Mukhtar Holland, that's commented upon by Al-Hamwi and by Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria Ansari, also commented upon by Sidi Abdul Ghani and Nabulsi. It begins, كُلُّكَ شِرْكٌ خَفِي. Your entirety is subtle association of partners with Allah. Your entirety is subtle insincerity. وَلَنْ يَبِينَ لَكَ التَّوْحِيدِ, and pure divine oneness will not be manifest for you. حَتَّى تَخْرُجَ بِهِ عَنْكَ, until you leave by Him, by Allah, from yourself. فَتَكُونَ بِهِ, so you are by Him. لَا بِنَفْسِكَ, not by yourself. Then the treatise continues. Right? And this is something that, the subtle realities of sincerity, sirr al-ikhlas. That's why Ibn Ata'illah calls it sirr al-ikhlas. Right? Because ikhlas has a obvious form. So I'm doing this for Allah. But it has layers, and it has a lub, it has an essence. And it requires effort and effort and effort. Right? That's of the many reasons why the Prophet ﷺ systematically taught us to seek forgiveness of Allah. Right? That He cover the subtle, cover not only our sin, but also our shortcomings in sincerity. Cover our shortcomings in obedience, in ibadah, our shortcomings in sincerity, and our shortcomings in consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Naam. La ba'sa bil ghibta. He says, it's true that there's nothing wrong with positive envy. Right? Right? Positive envy is when you recognize the good that someone else has and you want the like of that good for yourself, with a good intention behind wanting that good, and you don't want the other person's good to diminish in any way. Right? So for example, let's say Zayn is an excellent teacher. Let's say Zubair is an awful teacher. Every time he does a class, the students all take a washroom break and they never come back because he just doesn't know how to explain anything. So Zubair sees Zayn's class, he says, "Oh Allah, make me an effective teacher like Zayn is, like Hamza is, like Ustad Yumn is, like Ustad Sufyan is, like all these different people." Right? That's ghibta. You want the good, you ask Allah for the good that another has for a good intention, seeking the pleasure of Allah. Because I want to be able to benefit people like they benefit people, because I want the reward of muallim al-nas al-khair, of being someone who teaches people the good. So I can be of those who seek your pleasure. وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ قَوْلًا مِمَّنْ دَعَا إِلَى اللَّهِ. Who is better in statement than one who calls to Allah? وَعَمِلَ صَالِحًا, and who does righteous deeds. So I want your good pleasure, Ya Rabb. And you don't want them to lose their good or be slowed down in it or fall short in any way whatsoever. And we'll be seeing when we look at envy, what are the parameters of positive envy? But broadly, there are three. That you want that good for yourself, seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala thereby, without wanting the other person to lose or be disadvantaged with respect to their good in any way whatsoever. Broadly, these are three elements of positive envy. But until you have trained yourself to be sincere, keep away from that kind of thing, because it's slippery slope. ومنها أن الأكابر إذا حضروا مجلسه يغير كلامه. And from the signs of insincerity, of subtle insincerity, is when notables attend one's gathering, one changes one's speech. عما كان عليه, from what they used to do before, تصنعا واستمالة لقلوبهم, out of putting on airs and seeking to attract to make their hearts incline towards one. And notables, whether this be scholars or it be leaders, or it be the wealthy. You change how you speak. And again, why are you doing it? Right? Because if you look at, a constituent action, you started your lesson lillahi ta'ala. Now, is the lesson one action? No. Every word in it are micro actions together, but there are these choices, right? And these choices you need to be careful of. Right? So you have to be on guard. You're speaking, you notice that Shaykh so-and-so comes in. Right? So anytime anything changes, then you are continuing. But is your motive the same as it was before? That's the aspect of istishabun niyyah. But hifdun niyyah, you guard your intention. When any factors change, you recognize that that person sitting in front of you is a famous professor. You reckon, oh, that's a minister of parliament. That's the mayor of whatever town. That's that wealthy donor, right? Someone texts you during the class. By the way, that sister sitting on the edge, she is one of the biggest donors to such and such project. So suddenly you start, mentioning stories of great wealthy women who donated generously, whatever. And these are things that people, that's what, we repeatedly mention the amazing words of Sayyid Abu al-Hasan al-Shadhili, that مَنْ لَمْ يَتَغَلْغَلْ فِي عِلْمِنَا هَذَا, whoever doesn't become deeply immersed in this knowledge of ours, مَاتَ مُصِرًّا عَلَى الْكَبَائِرِ, will die continually committing enormities. وَهُوَ لَا يَشْعُرُ, and they don't think about it. They don't even feel it, recognize it, realize it. نعم لو زاد ما يتعلق بإصلاحهم, if one increases that which relates to their rectification, بلطف ورفق, with gentleness and wisdom. What does it say then? ليستدرجهم إلى التوبة, so that one subtly takes them towards repentance, for example. والصلاح, and towards righteousness. لحسن ذلك, that would be good. لكن محل تلبيس فإن اشتبه عليه فلينظر إلى الخلق بعين واحدة. But, so if one changes one's speech with a good intention for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That someone comes, is a very prominent Muslim businessman, and you want to share some things that to help guide them towards the good, for their sake, for the private sake, and for the public sake. Right? What was the dua of the Prophet ﷺ for two of the Quraysh? Allahumma hdi ahabbal umarayni ilayk. Who are the two Umars? Yeah, Sayyidina Umar and Abu Jahl. Why Abu Jahl? What was his name? Amr ibn. Right? So Allah guide one of the. Why? Because of their qualities. That they right? So one has to make tahreer of one's intention, How does one learn this? One learns, firstly, texts don't talk, right? Right? But one learns not only from studying with teachers, one has to observe how do these teachers act, and to remain connected with teachers who are, it's amazing the examples of living sincerity, right? These people, there are people who like spreading distrust of ulama, right? And this is very, very dangerous. This is dajjalic, conscious or unconscious, right? Rather, get to know real scholars and be guided by them, be inspired by them, consult these, because لن يزال لا يزال طائفة من أمتي ظاهرين على الحق. There will always remain a group in my community manifest on the truth. لا يضرهم من يخالفهم, not affected by those who oppose them. ولا من يخذلهم, nor by those who put them down. حتى يأتي أمر الله, until the command of Allah comes. وهم على ذلك, and they're on that. Those ulama are alive, they're known, they're manifest. So for us to be in safety, we should connect with them and be guided by them and remain under the shade of their light, which is the light of prophetic inheritance, right? But we're uncertain, right? فإن اشتبه عليه, let's look at all creation with one eye, right? Right? And so speak to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Right? And one's tested. I know my good friend Shaykh Zahir, several times when our common teacher Shaykh Nuh Keller has come to Toronto, he's tried to have Shaykh Nuh go and attend the khutbah I'm giving. One year he got away with it. He tried to convince me to give khutbah at his masjid, Jamiat al-Ansar. I realized what the game was. I said, see Zahir, I'm not going to do it. I'm already committed. He said, where? I tried not to tell him. I made the mistake of telling. He said, okay. He hung up the phone. Convinced Shaykh Nuh to go to where I was giving khutbah. Because not that far away, the Sayyidah Khadija Center. I realized, a long story, because when Shaykh Nuh's dars finished, which is about an hour before Dhuhr, there's all this clamor, people saying, Shaykh Nuh's not going to be praying here. Immediately I know what's going on. Shaykh Zahir had convinced him to go where I was going to be. But then, that's where you have to pause and reflect. That why am I doing this, or why am I not doing this? And what is sincerity? Sincerity is not to act for other than Allah, nor to leave any action for the sake of other than Allah. And to guard oneself from subtle insincerity. So what does one try to do? Speak for the sake of Allah. Speak as you would have spoken normally. And I wanted to remind myself of sincerity. So what I did, just my own example, I said, how can I make sure I'm sincere? This is my teacher, my mentor, my spiritual guide. There. Thank God he always sits on the far right. So I said, practically, I'm going to look, I'm going to you position yourself. So I would turn, so I was that way, but I never made eye contact where he was. So just not to get nervous, but alhamdulillah, I've experienced speaking, so that's not a big deal. But how are you not insincere? So I said, Bismillah, I'm going to speak about sincerity. I intend to remind myself, and I made the topic, keep things simple. Know that you're weak. So I decided to speak about sincerity. I said it, that what is sincerity? Why is sincerity important? How do you guard your sincerity? How do you bring sincerity into your devotion, into your life? And what to do when your sincerity is tested. And my intention was to make the whole talk a reminder to myself. Right? And you don't care. You don't want to please your teacher. You don't want to displease your teacher. You're doing it for the sake of Allah. But you make multiple intentions. I want to seek the pleasure of Allah by this. I want to remind myself and remind others, and this and that. And if you include in your secondary intention that I want to bring happiness to my teacher's heart for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But you have to be on guard for intentions like that, because all kinds of ulterior motives can come in. نسأل الله العافية واللطف والمغفرة والستر. Any questions here before we continue?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
How do we prevent the struggle for sincerity from overcoming our presence with the action itself?
How does one keep one's struggle for sincerity from affecting the action itself? You know, the Prophet ﷺ said, remember the general principles related to action, right? Those principles laid out in the opening 25 chapters of Riyadh al-Salihin, but particularly of the idea of al-iqtisadu fil ibadah, balance in one's devotion, right? And you know, our beloved Messenger ﷺ taught that istaqimu walan tuhsu, strive for complete uprightness, and you will not be able to do so completely. So what do? Saddidu, fasaddidu, waqaribu, wa abshiru. So remain steadfastly committed. Sadad. Know what your target is. Right? Saddada, this is fa'ala pattern. What does the fa'ala pattern indicate?
Transitivity.
What does that mean?
So, muta'addi.
What does that mean? Yeah, but saddidu is one of the active forms, right? Of saddada is to actively strive to apply the meaning, right? Right? So remain steadfastly committed, right? Towards what? Saddidu, right? There is an implicit saddada, because remain steadfastly committed, it has an object, but the object is implicit. Fasaddidu, remain committed to your goal, right? Now we don't come up with meanings. That's why it's important to go to the commentaries on these hadiths and what do they have to say. But if we think grammatically, you see how the ulama are bringing out these meanings, those that do relate to this, right? Fasaddidu, actively strive to remain focused on your target, which is the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the rida Allah wa qurbahu wa thawabahu, right? Wa mahabbatahu, right? The good pleasure of Allah and His reward and His love. Fasaddidu. Wa qaribu. Qaribu, and exert yourself in doing the best you can. Right? But also qaribu has a second sense, which is also sound, which is qaribu, and remain focused on drawing closer to Allah. Right? Qaribu, do the best you can. Meaning, if you're not able to do it fully, like you're aiming for the target, you know, the dead center. But if you can't hit dead center, then try to get close. Qaribu, do the best you can. In intention, in the form of your action, and in your goals. Qaribu. Also has from muqaraba, which is actively remain committed on drawing closer and closer to Allah. And they give both possibilities. Why? Because they're both entailed in qaribu. Wa abshiru, and be of glad tidings. Right? But how do you inculcate that striving for istaqimu, for complete uprightness, and remaining committed and doing one's best and being of glad tidings? وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالْغَدْوَةِ وَالرَّوْحَةِ وَشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الدُّلْجَةِ, and seek assistance in the early mornings وَالرَّوْحَ, and the late afternoons, or the beginnings of the days and the ends of the days. وَشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الدُّلْجَ, and something of the depths of the night. Right? One is, this is how you bring consistency into your actions. That you're busy during your day, but anyone can bring good works of seeking Allah's pleasure, beginning of the day, end of the day, and at night. But also the meaning is that those times of devotion inculcate in you what? Lillahiyat, as they say in Urdu, right? That for Allah-ness, that sincerity, that cultivate your sincerity. Seek assistance. Seek assistance in what? Wasta'inu. Right? Seek assistance in attaining that uprightness for Allah, and in remaining committed, and in doing your best and continually trying to draw closer to Allah, and in being of glad tidings with the early mornings, the late afternoons, and something of the depths of the night, because this is what cultivates sincerity. Our awrad, our spiritual routines cultivate sincerity. They're training grounds for, they're everything, but they are training grounds for sincerity. But then you do your best. Imam al-Ghazali, in the book on the Adab al-Quran, in the Ihya, has this beautiful statement that one of the things that one leaves in one of the adab of the Quran is to leave takalluf in recitation of the Quran. One doesn't exaggerate in one's effort to adhere to the rules of tajweed. Why? Because it's bad adab with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imagine if, Sidi Hamza, you're my shaykh, right? If I come to you with a question, I say, as-salam. Let me say that again. As-salam alaykum. As-salamu alaykum. And I kept repeating myself, and how would you feel? Like you're just waiting to hear my question. If I took 5 minutes to come up with the question, how would you feel? And be honest.
Maybe a bit embarrassed.
Yeah, or be embarrassed or annoyed. I wasted your time. Okay? And is that good manners? No. They say too much. They say, المبالغة في الأدب قد تكون من سوء الأدب. Exaggerated exaggerated good manners can be bad manners. Right? Why? Because it annoys and inconveniences and goes beyond the purpose of, because the point of reciting Quran is for this, that this is for Lillahi Ta'ala, is to draw closer to Allah, to seek the pleasure of Allah, right? To express one's ubudiyya to Allah, all these different meanings. And by excessiveness, one loses the purpose of it. So, one strives for the intention, before, during, and after, but one does the best one can, because exaggerating in it is not good. And any time one can't strike that balance, one consults. That's one of the things to keep consulting about. It's one of the most important things to consult about is what should one's intention be? What should one's goals be? What should one's method be? What should one's priorities be? How does one balance? These, and the most important thing is ikhlas. Because the whole spiritual path is what? أن تكون عبدا لله خالصا, right? That you be, as one of the poets said, فإن حصل المرام يكون عبدا لله. If they attain what is sought from the spiritual path, then they will become a servant of Allah. Right? I think it's from Bushrakumu Khillani, one of the poems of Shaykh Ahmad al-Alawi al-Mustaghanimi. Right? Any other questions? Okay, so the fifth investigation related to riya, and we can break it. Rulings relate to sincerity or showing off, right? Because riya, and of course there's actual, if you keep in mind, right? There is riya relates to in matters of religion and in worldly matters. In matters of religion, it is sinful. In worldly matters, it is, as we said, it is khatir. It's dangerous, but it's not inherently sinful. Then there's active riya, where you actively did something for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's other times where you weren't exactly sure. Right? So it's good to do a mental review of the previous four sections. What moved you to show off, right? Why did you want that recognition, for example? Right? Which is what people show off for, right? That jah, right? And the like of it, the status, right? Was it for a good reason? Was it for a sinful reason? Was it for a worldly reason? Right? There's the various discussions. Be aware of the subtleties of showing off, which we saw in the previous section. So if we keep those things in mind, then he tells us, اعلم أن الرياء بعمل الدنيا لا يحرم إن خلا عن التلبيس والتزوير ولم يتوسل به إلى منهي عنه. He says, know well, and I'm shocked. I have an advanced class in Hanafi fiqh with some students yesterday, and we raised this issue that who is worse off? Who is in more danger with respect to insincerity? The one teaching Quran to one person privately in the corner of the masjid, where no one else is there besides the two, or a Muslim politician running for office and promoting themselves all over the place. Who's in more danger? More immediate danger of falling into sin? The Quran teacher. Because this is devotion. And if your intention is not there for Allah, you're in deep trouble. The politics, dunya, it doesn't. لو كانت الدنيا تعدل عند الله جناح بعوضة ما سقى منها الكافرة جرعة ماء. If this worldly life mattered to Allah to the extent of the wing of a fly, the one who rejects Allah himself, who rejects their creator, would not get a sip of water in it. Right? I made all of this for you. I am sustaining you. You deny me. Right? But yeah, this is a rational proof given by the Prophet ﷺ that one can unpack for a long time, but we won't. So he says, know well that showing off in worldly actions is not in itself impermissible if it is free of deception, right? Or giving false impressions. Because deception could result in you lying, kadhib or khiyana or ghish, lying, cheating, deception, lying, deception, cheating, they're all haram. It can result in betraying of trust, breaking of promises, wrongfully taking the rights of others, etc. وَلَمْ يُتَوَسَّلْ بِهِ إِلَى مَنْهِيٍ عَنْهُ. And this worldly insincerity, worldly showing off, is not taken as a means towards something that is interdicted. You showed off in order to take people's wealth, etc. The meanings that to take people's wealth in sinful ways, to deny other people their rights, etc. Right? And from that is, if it doesn't result in you falling into sin, pride, arrogance, conceit, envy, etc. ولكن إن كان للحظ الآجل, however, if it is for some immediate gain, right, if it is, right, for some immediate gain, meaning if you showed off just for worldly gain, right, فمذموم, right, it's blameworthy, right, and it's somewhat disliked. Why? Because anything in which there is clear potential harm is somewhat disliked. And this is broadly the principles of harm, maratib al-darar, and they're defined for outward harm. But if you think about it, and the ulama tell us very explicitly, maratib al-darar, what are the levels of harm, right? 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 Where? And I believe this is there, it's in the Hadiyah or the Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya, in Nahlawi. I'm pretty sure it's in Nahlawi. If you look under darar, it's there, right? Anything in which there is reasonable possibility of harm, engaging in it is, without guarding yourself from that harm, is makruh, is somewhat disliked. If there's small possibility of harm, right, it's somewhat disliked and closer to khilaf al-awla, it's contrary to what's better. The more likely the harm is, the dislikedness increases. When إذا كان الضرر غالبا, if the harm is overwhelmingly likely, what would the ruling be? It's sinful, and it's makruh tahriman, it's prohibitively disliked. When the harm is immediate, direct, and certain, it's outright haram. And in the outward things, they use the example of if you mix sand in water and you drink it, is there potential for harm? Yes. But is it overwhelming? No. Right? There's reasonable possibility of harm. It's makruh. But if you have glass shards in water, right, there's a high likelihood of harm. It's makruh tahriman, it's sinful. Sometimes something that has slight harm, if you do it continually, could become prohibitively disliked. And you could apply this to dietary choices, to all kinds of things. But there's a difference between, there's water with some glass shards in it, it's mixed up, you drink it, is there likely to be harm from ingesting glass shards? But it's also possible that nothing would happen, right? But that's, what does Allah say? لا تلقوا لا تلقوا بأيديكم إلى التهلكة. Don't cast yourselves by your own doing, by your own hands, meaning by your own doing, towards destruction. لا ضرر, and the principles of harm apply, but the maratib of darar, right? And then there's direct, which is there's poison that kills human beings, and you decide to drink some. That's outright haram. That's the nature of worldly engagement as well, right? Even the slightest of it, there's some doing it out of insincerity, particularly those things that are, but dunya, there are danger zones in dunya. Of the danger zones in dunya are ma fihi jah, that which has status and recognition. Why? Because the difference between, anyone can discern the difference between someone just goes to a regular job and someone wants to be that high flying, high status, high recognition, high this, high that. Why? Because the connection between that and self-harm, spiritual self-harm, and worldly harm of oneself and others is much greater. Who is more likely to abuse others? The one who has no status and no recognition, or the one who has power, authority, wealth, and status? Right? So where you are insincere and seek status simply for some worldly gain, this is blameworthy. And we'd say khatir. Right? So this is not just talking about doing anything worldly for other than Allah. This is where status is sought. You know, there's difference between you just cooking your own food, right? But between that, you start your YouTube channel. Right? So see, the Hamza's mastered the art of making hot dogs at home. Hamza's hot dog channel. Right? And why are you doing it? Just because, you know, like what? Right? It's dangerous because all kinds of harms creep in. Right? حب الجاه والمنزلة, حب الثناء, right? All these love of recognition and praise and status and so on. Then your channel gets 100,000 people, but the other channel has 2.5 million people, right? So envy creeps in. Then these things creep in. Then and then it elbows out other concerns in life, right? 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 So if you do something worldly, seeking recognition, merely for worldly gain, it's madhmoom, it's blameworthy, somewhat disliked in itself, and dangerous, because it could lead to actual sin. وَإِلَّا, right? If it's not for worldly gain, فَمُسْتَحَبْ لِمَا بَيَّنَّا فِي حُبِّ الرِّيَاسَةِ. But if you do something worldly, not for worldly gain, but rather as a means to seek the pleasure of Allah and next worldly gain, then it could be recommended. What would an example of that be? It says for the reasons that we made clear when we looked at the issue of seeking leadership, love of leadership, right? That you want a position on the city council. What's the ruling of you? You just want it because I want to pad my resume. What's the ruling of this? It's madhmoom. It's dangerous. And it's dangerous. Right? To the extent of the harm. Right? Someone could be ghafil, they just, why not? But it's danger, because intentions, you get close to the slippery edge, you fall quickly. Or you fall and you don't realize it. But and that's the promise of the shaitan. لَأَغْوِيَنَّهُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ. I will indeed lead them astray, all of them. إِلَّا عِبَادَكَ مِنْهُمْ الْمُخْلَصِينَ. Right? Except for your servants amongst them. Right? Al-Mukhlasin, who have been made sincere. Right? Ibadak, right? Who are the ibad of Allah? Those who act out of obeying the divine command, seeking the good pleasure of Allah, and who've been made sincere. How have they been made sincere? Because in all that they do, they strive to seek to attain sincerity. But also it indicates, the shaitan recognizes that ikhlas is granted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The actualization of sincerity is granted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And there's many lessons in that satanic satanic commitment. But shaitan has a life purpose. Right? Right? Okay? Shaitan's life, intention and purpose slip, and that's his purpose. He wants to make us slip. But be abd lillah mukhlisan hatta tusbiha mukhlasan. Be a servant of Allah. Serve Allah in what you do it for Allah, seeking the pleasure of Allah until you become mukhlas, you become purified in your intent. But if some worldly status is sought for the sake of Allah in a manner pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that this will be a means to seek what is right. Right? Or you want to prevent injustices, or you want to gain a better position at work, to reach a manager level. Why? Because why should other people tell me what to do? I want to tell people what to do. Is it haram to seek to become a manager at work? No. What's the ruling? If it's just for that, there's clear potential harm in it. So do you mean you don't seek? No, because if you become a manager, you'll earn more. But earning more, what is its ruling? What's the ruling of just earning more? Permissible. But it remains dangerous. Why? Because other things creep into it. You realize the senior managers make more than me, so you become envious of them. You realize that you make more than some others. You become proud. You got a bonus, you become conceited. Right? All kinds of things happen. You become worldly. You become actively insincere. But you want a better position at work, so you can earn more, so you can work more limited hours, so you can free yourself for worship. So you can free yourself for seeking the good. Right? So even in work, seeking positions at work, seeking to be successful in your whatever project you're involved in your startup company. You want that award. Is it bad to seek an award for your startup company? Yeah. Seeking an award is a worldly recognition, right? Why are you seeking it? Right? Why are you seeking it? Right? So what's the ruling of seeking? You start a startup company. So Sidi Hamza has mastered the art of homemade hot dogs. And they're organic, they don't have filler meat, whatever. Organic, ethically raised, right? He calls them happy hot dogs because they come from happy animals. So Sidi Hamza, what would the ruling be of you seeking an award for Hamza's happy hot dogs to be best startup of the year?
Permissible?
It's in itself permissible. But that's the hukm al-ibtida'i. But then what is the specific ruling that it would take? That why were you doing it? Right? So if you just did it because I want to make more money, right? If I get this prize, we'll, whatever magazine, it has this many viewers, etc., followers, etc., it'll get us this much more money. I'll make more money. If it's purely for worldly gain, what is the ruling?
It's madmoom.
It's madmoom. And it's dangerous. It's blameworthy. And it's dangerous because it'll lead to, what if you don't get the prize? How are you going to feel towards those who won the prize if all you're just seeking material gain? Envy, there's reasonable fear that envy could creep in. If you win, you could become proud because you're seeking worldly gain, you got it. Then what? Right? But it could also be recommended or even greater, that you make high intentions. I want to get that. Why? Because I want this startup to support my studies, my da'wah. If this startup is successful, I want to make a commitment to fund these following projects. We make high intentions. What's the ruling then? Right? إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Right? That's in purely worldly matters, right? Like the hot dog startup, right? Now, وَأَمَّا الرِّيَاءُ فِي الْعِبَادَةِ فَحَرَامٌ كُلُّهُ. As for showing up in acts of devotion, right? And he gives a nice definition here, right? Of what's a ibadah, what's an act of devotion, right? Is التي كانت مشروعيتها لمجرد تعظيم الله تعالى وتحصيل رضاه. Right? That these are those acts that are done whose primary purpose is to venerate Allah and to attain His good pleasure. And we've talked about that being the acts of worship, the acts of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the means to that, which is knowledge, da'wah, and khidmah, and the khidmat al-umur al-dunyawiyya, khidmat masalih al-muslimin al-diniyya, serving the religious interests. Right? So then we'll continue here from the rulings of riya, the worldly riya, but which requires caution. They should be from the practical toolkit of believers, right? And we have to remind people. They say, The ulama mean what they say, right? And true ulama don't just say random things just like that. But they say, you know, that one of the greatest things one can learn from the fuqaha is mabhathun niyya, is intention. And to have intentions in everything, to have sincerity in everything, and to have multiple intentions even in one's worldly actions. And there's a wonderful work that it was good to keep in Arabic and to consult frequently. And it's also translated into English, which is Kitabun Niyat by Habib Sa'd al-Eidarus, rahimahullah ta'ala. It's translated into English as the Book of Intentions and it's recently been republished. The Book of Intentions by Habib Sa'd al-Eidarus. And it's available for purchase. And then we'll see what are the legal rulings of showing off in acts of worship. And this is a critical section that we'll look at bi'idhnillahi ta'ala next week. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله وصحبه وحزبه والحمد لله رب العالمين. Any questions before we close?
If we're worshiping by ourselves, but the thought passes our mind that if only so and so would see us, they'd be impressed. Is that vanity or is that riya?
Could you say that again?
Let's say we're worshiping by ourselves, and a passing thought comes to us. If only so and so who would see us, they'd be impressed, or they'd find it, or they would like it. What is that?
No, so that's a good question. What the thing we should do with questions, that's one of the things we study logic for, right? It's a really good question, Sidi. And one of the things I look forward to are these questions you guys ask. Right? MashaAllah, they're thinking people's questions. But let's apply what is the ruling of thoughts? Right? Shaykh Adib would always say, it's a beautiful principle, right? Rahmatullah. It's like a truism, but it's a very beneficial, practical truism. That تُعْرَفُ الْأُمُورِ بِتَعْرِيفِهَا. Matters are known by their definitions. So what, right? Or تُعْرَفُ الْأُمُورِ بِأَحْكَامِهَا. No, matters are known by their rulings, right? What is the ruling of a thought? When is one accountable for a thought?
According to Imam Birgivi, when we accept it.
Yeah, when one accepts the thought, right? When one embraces the thought, right? And we know the maratib al-khawatir, right? The levels of our thoughts, right? The first thought, no accountability. Considering it is more dangerous, but there's no accountability. Inclining towards it is yet more dangerous, yet there's no accountability. Accountability comes when one accepts it, when one says yes to it, or one turns that acceptance into so resolve or determination, right? Level 4 or level 5, and there's khilaf exactly when one is accountable for it between level 4 and level 5, right? But the more one engages with the thought, the more danger there is from harmful thoughts, right? But the thoughts that come, so one should seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from those thoughts, right? Right? If someone walks in Shaykh, the ulama state from Shaykh al-Akbar, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, that any time someone, you become conscious of someone else present, just intend at-ta'lim lillahi ta'ala. That you're teaching for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if you didn't actually have the thought of insincerity. Because then, if you have that intention, genuinely for the sake of Allah, then however much you did your prayer better, and you're genuine in that intention, the more you get rewarded for it. And then the shaitan will give up, right? So you're praying on your own and you're kind of like tired and whatever. Good friend comes up. They say, if he notices me, anything that I'm doing it, to teach for the sake of niyat at-ta'lim lillahi ta'ala, but for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then even if you then prayed unusually better than you normally do, you'll be rewarded for it rather than being punished for it. Okay? Eventually the shaitan will give up on those kinds of tricks, right? But he'll pick other tricks. But that's where sidq is so powerful. Right? Sidq. Istiwa'u al-zahiri wal-batin. Sayyidi, do you have Habib Umar's treatise on حقيقة التصوف وسمات أهله in Arabic?
Yes, as a bilingual edition.
Yeah. But you can find the Arabic only as well, right? But the definition there of sidq, of being true, is one of the most spectacular definitions anywhere, right? And if someone wants to recognize and appreciate what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with in our age of great scholars, such as Habib Umar, take that definition of sidq and then compare it with previous great definition. You find that's a great opening from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on this man, right? And hit so many of the different things that the ulama have mentioned about sidq. And you could share it with us, inshallah. I mean, it's right there. But the PDF of the Arabic is around. If you look at حقيقة التصوف وسمات أهله, or just حقيقة التصوف Habib Umar, you'll find it. It's on a very strange website, but alhamdulillah. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Any other questions? Okay, so we'll stop here. Walhamdulillah.